We need to verify her citizenship status.
Do you have a warrant?
I know my rights! Please, she's done nothing wrong.
I don't care what information you have. You are not getting anywhere near my staff without a judicial warrant and proper authorization. Ma'am, we're federal agents. We don't require your permission. Actually, you do. This is a school. We have student privacy protections, employee rights, and established protocols, and none of them include letting masked agents drag teachers out of hallways. The standoff erupted at 10:47 a.m. on an ordinary Tuesday in October, in the main corridor of Westbrook Academy in Atlanta, Georgia. What began as two masked ICE agents demanding access to an English literature teacher escalated within minutes into an entire faculty forming a human shield around their colleague, Principal Mark Calloway, and teacher Dana Reeves physically wrapping their arms around Betty Hansen, colleagues closing ranks behind them until the hallway became a wall of people who simply would not move. Every second of it was captured on school bodycam footage. Every second of it is about to go viral. And every second of it led to a federal court ruling that would award Betty Hansen $12 million, while exposing what happens when a broken government database meets a black woman standing alone in a school hallway. If you believe educators deserve protection, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if this is your first time here, subscribe now, because tomorrow's story involves the wrong people getting pushed too far, and finding out. Betty Hansen was 36 years old, a born and raised daughter of Birmingham, Alabama, the granddaughter of a woman who marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and never let Betty forget what that walk cost. She'd grown up in a household where books were treated like oxygen, necessary, non-negotiable, life-giving. She'd been the first in her family to earn a college degree, working night shifts at a hotel laundry while carrying a full course load in English literature, surviving on determination and the memory of every teacher who'd ever told her she was worth something. She came back to Atlanta not for prestige or salary. She came back because the kids in her district reminded her of herself, overlooked, underestimated, brilliant in ways the system wasn't designed to measure. She wanted to be the teacher she'd needed when she was 15 and angry and convinced no one in power cared whether she made it. 6 years at Westbrook Academy proved she was right to come back. Her students didn't just pass state assessments, they exceeded them. Her classroom, room 114, was the one students fought to get into, the one where desks sat in circles instead of rows, where their eyes were watching God and the bluest eye sat alongside Shakespeare, where no student was made to feel stupid for asking a question out loud. Her lesson plans were studied by newer teachers. Her methods were borrowed without credit. Her results were celebrated in district newsletters while she was passed over, twice, for department chair, both times in favor of colleagues with less tenure and weaker outcomes. She was a naturalized U.S. citizen. Had been since she turned 18. She had documentation, a U.S. passport, a voter registration card, and a spotless record that included a background-cleared seat on the school's safety committee the prior year. She was, by every legal and civic measure, exactly where she belonged. That Tuesday morning, Betty was mid-lesson, 32 students arranged in their circle, a worn copy of Zora Neale Hurston open on her desk, when the classroom door opened in a way that didn't feel like a student arriving late. A freshman office aide named Marcus appeared in the frame, his face carrying an expression Betty had never seen on a 14-year-old before, the particular look of someone who has just witnessed something that doesn't belong in a school building. 2 men in black tactical gear had entered through the main corridor, their boots striking the polished floor with a rhythm that silenced hallway chatter without a word. Their vests bore 4 letters in bold white block print. Their faces were masked. They moved with the posture of people who had never once been told no and did not expect today to be different. They asked for Betty Hansen by name. Inside room 114, Betty set down her dry erase marker. Her students looked up from their books, confusion spreading across the room like a current. She stepped into the hallway, and the door had barely closed behind her before she saw them, and understood, and felt something cold and ancient move through her chest. The school's protocols for law enforcement visits were clear. What happened next was not. Before that hallway, before the agents and the bodycam footage and the $12 million, there was room 114. 32 students arranged in a circle, not rows, never rose. With dog-eared copies of their eyes were watching God open on their desks and the kind of focused energy in the room that teachers spend entire careers trying to manufacture. Betty Hansen stood at the center of it, not behind a podium, not anchored to the whiteboard, but moving, pausing at one desk, crouching beside another, asking questions she already knew the answers to because the point was never the answer. The point was watching a 16-year-old discover they had won. So when Zora writes that Janie's horizon called to her, Betty said, her voice unhurried, what is she actually saying about whose permission Janie needed to live her life? The room crackled. 3 hands shot up. A girl in the back, quiet all semester, barely a word since September, leaned forward in her chair like something had just unlocked inside her chest. This was what Betty Hansen did. Not performed. Did. She had spent 6 years at Westbrook Academy building something that couldn't be captured on a district evaluation form. Her students' literacy scores were the highest in the school, had been for 4 consecutive years. Colleagues borrowed her curriculum frameworks without asking. Newer teachers hovered near her classroom door during her free periods, listening through the wall. The students who graduated and went on to college came back to visit her specifically, not the school, her, by name, with specific memories of specific conversations she'd had with them when they were failing and frightened and convinced they weren't smart enough. She knew all of this about herself with quiet certainty. She did not say it out loud. She had learned early, the way black women in institutions learn things, through accumulated small lessons that nobody announces directly, that excellence and visibility were not the same currency. Her performance reviews were glowing documents that lived in a filing cabinet and went nowhere. When the department chair position opened the first time, she applied. A colleague with 3 fewer years of experience and test scores that didn't come close got the role. The feedback she received was vague in the specific way that vague feedback always is when the real reason can't be spoken in a formal meeting. The second time, she almost didn't apply. She did anyway. The outcome was the same. She had made a private decision after that. She would put everything she had into room 114 and let the circle of desks and the dog-eared books and the girl in the back row leaning forward be enough. She would be extraordinary in the place where it mattered most and learn not to need the institution to confirm it. She had become, without meaning to, very good at making herself small enough to stay safe. She would not get to stay safe much longer. The morning had been ordinary in the way that only mornings you later reconstruct in painful detail can be. Cool air coming off the Georgia October like a warning nobody read. Betty had arrived before 7, the parking lot still half empty, the school building holding that particular pre-dawn quiet that she had always loved, the stillness before 32 students brought the room to life. She made her first coffee in the faculty lounge, graded a stack of response journals at the small corner table she'd claimed as unofficially hers over 6 years of early mornings. The journals were good. Better than good. A boy named Darius, who had spent most of September with his head down and his hood up, had written 2 full pages about Janie Crawford and what it meant to want something for yourself that nobody around you had language for. Betty read it twice. Made a note in the margin, "This is exceptional. Save this." And felt the particular quiet satisfaction of work that matters. She brewed her second coffee at 9:15. Exchanged 12 words with the vice principal passing through. Returned 2 parent emails. Pulled up her lesson plan for third period and adjusted a discussion question she'd been turning over in her mind since the previous night. Normal. Ordinary. The unremarkable texture of a Tuesday that had no reason to be anything else. By 10:30 she was back in room 114, walking her first period class through a close reading exercise, the desks in their circle, the room doing what it always did when Betty was at the front of it. A student named Kezia was making an argument about narrative voice that was sharp enough to redirect the entire discussion, and Betty was letting her, stepping back, giving the room space to follow Kezia's thinking wherever it went. This was the work. This was all of it. At 10:47, the classroom door opened. It was Sandra Okafor, one of the front office secretaries, a woman Betty had shared lunch with dozens of times, whose daughter had been in Betty's class 3 years prior, who was not the type to interrupt an active lesson for anything short of genuine urgency. She stood in the doorway with her lanyard twisted in both hands and an expression that sat somewhere between alarm and careful composure, the face of someone trying not to alarm 32 teenagers. "Miss Hanson." Her voice was low. Controlled. "Could I borrow you for just one moment?" Betty stepped into the hallway. Sandra pulled the door almost closed behind her, glanced once toward the main corridor, and lowered her voice further. "There are federal agents at the front desk. 2 of them, maybe 3. Tactical gear." A pause. "They're asking about a teacher." Betty's first thought, immediate, instinctive, the thought of someone who had spent a career worrying about her students before herself, was that one of her kids was in trouble. It did not yet occur to her that she was. They didn't wait. That was the detail that would stay with Betty long after everything else had been processed and litigated and reduced to a settlement figure, the fact that they simply didn't wait. Sandra had barely finished her sentence when the sound came from the end of the corridor, boots on polished floor, heavy and deliberate, the kind of sound that doesn't ask whether it's welcome. 2 agents in full tactical gear rounded the corner into the hallway before anyone had been notified, before the principal had been called, before any of the protocols that existed precisely for this kind of situation had been given the chance to function. They moved like the building's rules applied to other people. Their faces were masked. Their vests said ICE in white block letters that seemed almost too large for the space, too blunt, too out of place against the student artwork pinned to the corridor walls on either side of them. Betty saw them and understood in the space of a single breath what Sandra hadn't been able to say directly. The taller agent spoke first. His voice carried the flat, procedural calm of someone reading from a script they've delivered many times before. "Betty Hanson?" She didn't answer immediately. Later she would not be able to explain why, only that something in her body made the decision before her mind caught up, some deep-coded survival instinct that said, "Do not confirm anything yet. We need you to come with us. Now, please." The please landed like a formality stapled to a demand. His partner had already shifted slightly to her left, a subtle repositioning that closed one angle of the hallway without appearing to. Betty felt it before she registered it consciously, the geometry of the situation rearranging itself around her. She never got to respond. The door to the main office swung open and Principal Mark Calloway stepped into the hallway with the expression of a man who had heard a tone in the building he didn't recognize and trusted his instincts enough to investigate it immediately. He took in the scene in under 2 seconds, the agents, their positioning, Betty's face, and he walked forward without hesitation and placed himself between her and them. "What is this? Who authorized you past the front office?" Neither agent answered the question. One repeated the demand. Calloway repeated his. Then Dana Reeves appeared from the classroom across the hall, drawn by the raised voices, and she didn't ask questions or assess the situation or wait to understand the full picture. She walked directly to Betty's side and put her hand on Betty's arm and did not move. 30 seconds later a third colleague materialized on Betty's other side, and then a fourth behind her, and the hallway began to fill with people who had heard something wrong and responded the way people respond when the thing they are protecting is something they actually love. Nobody planned it. Nobody coordinated. The body cam was already rolling. Dana Reeves would tell a reporter months later that she didn't think. And she meant it not as a disclaimer but as a precise description of what happened in her body when she stepped into that hallway, the complete and total absence of calculation. She had described herself as, not political, at a staff meeting the prior spring, in the context of a conversation about a district policy she'd rather not weigh in on, and she'd meant that too. She was a humanities teacher who liked her classroom and her students and her corner table in the faculty lounge and the particular piece of a life lived mostly outside of conflict. She saw Betty's face and crossed the hallway in 4 steps and grabbed her arm just above the elbow, and that was the end of Dana Reeves being not political. She didn't let go. Not when the agent's eyes moved to her. Not when his posture shifted with the particular irritation of someone unaccustomed to being physically obstructed by a woman in a red blouse holding a colleague's arm like it was the only thing tethering both of them to the ground. She looked straight ahead and she did not let go. Calloway was speaking. His voice had settled into a register Betty had never heard from him before, not loud, not theatrical, but precise in the way that a person is precise when they understand that every word is being recorded and they want the record to be absolutely clear. You do not have a judicial warrant. An administrative warrant does not grant you the authority to detain a United States citizen on school grounds. You are in violation of this staff member's Fourth Amendment protections and I am formally asking you to step back. He said it the way you'd explain something important to someone you were giving every reasonable opportunity to make a better choice. The agents did not make a better choice. One of them began to speak about federal authority. Calloway let him finish and then repeated himself, word for word, with the same measured delivery, his voice captured cleanly on the bodycam audio that would later be played in a federal courtroom and watched by several million people on the internet. Behind Betty, the hallway was filling. There was no announcement, no signal, no group text sent between colleagues. Doors simply opened, drawn by raised voices, by instinct, by the specific frequency of something being wrong in a place that was supposed to be safe, and teachers stepped out and saw what was happening and did not go back inside. They gathered the way people gather around something that requires witnessing. A history teacher. 2 members of the English department. The school counselor still holding the coffee she'd been carrying when she heard the commotion. A custodian who stopped his cart and stood. Not one of them moved aside. The agents faced a corridor that had become, without ceremony or rehearsal, a wall of people who had collectively decided that this was the line and they were standing on it. 14 minutes. That was how long it took for District Legal Counsel Patricia Owens to arrive at Westbrook Academy after the front office placed the emergency call. 14 minutes from the moment Sandra Okafor's hand started shaking over her keyboard to the moment a woman in a gray blazer and low heels came through the main entrance walking with the focused velocity of someone who had assessed the situation entirely from a phone call and arrived already knowing what she was going to say. She introduced herself once, to no one in particular and everyone at once, and then she addressed the agents directly. What followed was not a confrontation in the way the standoff had been a confrontation. It was quieter and in some ways more devastating, the methodical dismantling of the legal ground the agents had assumed they were standing on. Owens laid it out without theater, without raising her voice, citing statute and precedent in the same tone a person uses to explain something that should not have required explanation. The administrative warrant they carried did not authorize the detention of a U.S. citizen. The failure to obtain a judicial warrant was not a procedural footnote, it was a constitutional violation, active and ongoing. The school district was prepared to file a trespassing complaint if the agents did not vacate the premises immediately. She said the word immediately and let it sit there. The agents exchanged a look that the bodycam captured clearly. A look that contained, if you watched the footage carefully enough, the precise moment when federal authority meets its actual boundary and has to decide whether to test it. They didn't test it. They left. No announcement. No acknowledgement of error. They walked back down the corridor the way they'd come, boots striking the same polished floor, and the crowd of faculty parted just enough to let them through and not 1 inch more. The main door swung shut behind them. Someone in the hallway exhaled audibly. Someone else said something under their breath that nobody asked them to repeat. Betty was already moving toward the faculty lounge before anyone thought to guide her there. Dana still had her hand on her arm. Calloway walked on her other side without touching her, just close enough to make clear he wasn't going anywhere. She made it to the small corner table, her table, the one where she'd graded Darius's journal that same morning, a lifetime ago, and she sat down and her legs simply stopped working the way legs do when a body has been running on adrenaline and the adrenaline is suddenly, completely gone. She was shaking. Hands first, then shoulders, the kind of trembling that has nothing to do with cold. Someone set a cup of tea in front of her that she didn't drink. Someone else said her name softly and she didn't answer. She would stop shaking eventually. It would take days. And by then, the footage would already be everywhere. Simone Garrett did not take every case that came to her. She was 41 years old, a civil rights attorney with a practice built over 15 years of deliberate, selective work, the kind of lawyer who read a case file the way a surgeon reads a scan, looking not for what was visible on the surface but for what the surface was hiding. She had turned down cases that looked good on paper and taken cases that looked impossible on principle, and her record reflected both the wisdom and the cost of that approach. She took Betty Hansen's case the same afternoon a colleague forwarded her the bodycam footage. She watched it once, closed her laptop, and made the call. What she told Betty in their first meeting was simple: the footage was powerful, but footage won arguments in the court of public opinion. What won arguments in a federal courtroom was paper. Documents. Internal communications. The institutional record that agencies generated in enormous quantities and guarded with enormous energy precisely because they understood what that record contained. Simone's job, she explained, was to get that paper, and then to make the people who created it explain every word of it under oath. Discovery began in November. By December, Simone had filed the requests. By January, when the government's responses arrived, partial, delayed, and arranged in the particular order that suggested someone had thought carefully about what to release first, she began to see the shape of what had actually happened. It started with a name. Betty J. Hansen. The J standing for Jean, which was Betty's middle name, given to her by a grandmother who had carried it from a small town in rural Alabama and passed it forward like an inheritance. The name was common enough that a database search returned multiple matches across multiple federal systems, a fact that should have triggered additional verification before any action was taken. It did not trigger additional verification. What it triggered was a flag, attached to a record belonging to a foreign national named Betty J. Hansen who had entered the United States on a work visa 8 years prior, overstayed by a significant margin, and accumulated a deportation order that had never been executed. This other Betty Hansen was 44 years old. She was several inches shorter than Betty. She had a documented history in the immigration system going back nearly a decade, with photographs, fingerprints, and identifying information on file. The Betty Hansen standing in room 114 at Westbrook Academy was a U.S. citizen by naturalization, with a passport, a voter registration, a social security record, and a background clearance granted by the school district the prior year, a clearance that had itself required federal verification. The two women did not look alike. Their biometric data did not match in any definitive way. What they shared was a name and a middle initial, and what the IC database had done, through a combination of algorithmic flagging and human failure to interrogate the algorithm's output, was treat that coincidence as confirmation. Simone found this in a report generated internally 3 days before the operation at Westbrook Academy. An analyst had noted the biometric discrepancy in the file. Had flagged it, using language that was careful and specific, as requiring secondary verification before any enforcement action was authorized. The report existed. It was dated. It was time-stamped. It had been received by the supervising agent on the case. No secondary verification was performed. What Simone found next was worse. The request for a judicial warrant, the document that would have required a federal judge to review the evidence and authorize the detention, had been initiated and then abandoned. The internal communications showed a brief exchange between the supervising agent and a colleague, in which the question of judicial warrant approval was raised and then set aside in favor of the administrative warrant they ultimately carried to the school. The reasoning, such as it was, appeared in a single line of an internal email that Simone would later read aloud in a federal courtroom to a silence so complete you could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. Admin warrant should be sufficient for a school visit. Let's move. Let's move. 3 words. Written by someone who had a report on their desk noting a biometric discrepancy and a pending verification flag and chose, instead of waiting, to move. Betty Hansen sat across from Simone in the attorney's office on a gray January afternoon and listened to all of this without interrupting. Simone laid it out methodically, the name match, the analyst's report, the abandoned warrant request, the email, and when she finished, Betty was quiet for a long moment. They knew, she said finally. Not a question. Someone knew there was a discrepancy that needed to be resolved, Simone said carefully. And they chose not to resolve it before sending agents to your school. Betty looked at the window. Outside, Atlanta was doing what Atlanta did in January: gray sky, bare trees, the city carrying on with the particular indifference of a place that did not know or care that a woman's life had been upended in a school hallway 3 months prior. She thought about Darius and his journal. She thought about the circle of desks. She thought about the specific shape of the lesson she'd been in the middle of when Sandra appeared at her door, Janie Crawford, and the question of whose permission you needed to live your life. She thought about the analyst's report sitting on a supervisor's desk, flagged and dated and ignored. "What does this mean for the case?" she asked. Simone Garrett opened her folder. Her expression was the expression of someone who has been waiting for precisely this question. "It means," she said, "that they can't call this a mistake and walk away. It means we can prove they had the information and chose not to use it. And it means that when we get in front of a judge, we won't just be arguing that something went wrong." She paused. "We'll be proving that someone decided not to make it right." Betty nodded slowly. Outside, the city carried on. Inside, something that had been quietly waiting in her chest for 36 years finally decided it was done being patient. The district released the footage on a Thursday afternoon, in response to a public records request filed by a local Atlanta journalist who had heard about the incident through a parent with a child at Westbrook Academy. The release was accompanied by a brief administrative statement confirming that an incident had occurred, that no staff member had been detained, and that the district was cooperating with ongoing legal proceedings. The statement was 7 sentences long. It was read by approximately 400 people. The footage was watched by 4 million within 36 hours. It moved the way certain things move online when they compress an entire argument into a single image, not virally in the shallow sense of the word, but with the specific momentum of content that people share not because it entertains them but because they feel, on some visceral level, that other people need to see it. The clip that spread fastest was 47 seconds long. It opened on the 2 agents in the corridor, cut to Calloway's voice asking clearly and calmly for a judicial warrant, and then held on a single frame: Betty Hansen in her mustard yellow blouse, Dana Reeves' hand gripping her arm, a colleague's hand at her other shoulder, and behind them the growing corridor of faculty who had simply refused to move. Her face in that frame was not the face of someone performing bravery. It was the face of someone trying to hold themselves together in front of their students and colleagues while their fundamental sense of safety was being dismantled in the hallway of the school they had given 6 years of their life to. That face is what made it spread. Teachers shared it first. Elementary school teachers, high school teachers, college professors, retired educators, people who had left the classroom and people who had never left. They shared it with captions that were sometimes furious and sometimes just a single line, the kind of line people write when words feel insufficient and they share anyway because silence feels worse. By Friday morning the hashtag #WeStandWithBetty had accumulated enough posts to trend nationally, and the posts were not abstract expressions of solidarity, they were photographs. Educators across the country standing in formation in their own hallways, arms linked, some in their classrooms surrounded by empty desks, some in staff parking lots in the early morning cold, all of them in some version of the same posture, together, facing forward, not moving. A high school principal in Detroit posted a photo of his entire staff arranged in the corridor outside his office. A retired teacher in Oakland posted a 40-year-old photograph of herself with 3 colleagues and wrote simply, "We have always done this." A first-grade teacher in rural Montana posted a picture of herself standing alone in front of her classroom door with her arms crossed and the caption, "One is enough." It got 240,000 likes by Saturday afternoon. The congressional response came within the week. 2 members of the House Education Committee issued statements. A subcommittee chair announced that hearings would be scheduled to examine the use of immigration enforcement actions on school grounds and the constitutional protections, or lack thereof, afforded to educators in those circumstances. The word "unprecedented" appeared in several of the statements, which Simone Garrett read with the expression of someone who found the word both accurate and insufficient. ICE issued a statement on Friday after the footage was dropped. It was 3 paragraphs long, written in the careful passive voice of institutional damage control, and it acknowledged that the operation had involved procedural considerations that are currently under internal review, without specifying what those considerations were, who had made the relevant decisions, or what the review might conclude. It did not use the word apology. It did not use the word error. It did not mention Betty Hansen by name. Simone filed it alongside the internal emails and the analyst's report and the abandoned warrant request and said nothing publicly, which was its own kind of statement. Betty gave her first interview on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the footage dropped, 10 days after the hashtag, 5 days after the congressional announcements. She had declined every request before this one, not from fear but from a need to be ready, to know what she wanted to say and how she wanted to say it and what she was willing to give to a camera and what she was not. The journalist was a woman she had agreed to speak with specifically because she had read 3 years of her work and trusted the quality of her listening. She sat in a chair in Simone's office, not at home, not at the school. She wore a dark blazer. Her hands were folded in her lap and they were not entirely still. She answered every question. She described the morning, the journals, the second coffee, Darius's 2 pages about Janie Crawford. She described the sound of the boots in the hallway and the way she understood, before she consciously understood, what was happening. She described what it felt like to stand in a building she had chosen, a community she had returned to by deliberate decision, and feel the ground shift beneath her in a way she had always, somewhere beneath her professional composure, been waiting to feel. "I have spent my entire career," she said, toward the end of the interview, her voice low and controlled and shaking in the way that voices shake when the emotion behind them is too large and too old to be fully contained, "making myself quiet enough that the institution would allow me to stay in it. And I stood in that hallway and I thought, I have done everything right. Every single thing. And here we are anyway." She paused. The journalist did not fill the silence. "What saved me," Betty said finally, "was that the people around me did not wait to be asked. They just came." She looked at her hands for a moment. "I didn't know institutions could do that. I'm still learning what to do with that. 7 months is a long time to hold something together. It is long enough for the initial wave of public attention to recede, for the congressional statements to be absorbed into the ongoing noise of institutional business, for the hashtag to fade from trending to archived, for the world to move on to the next thing while the person at the center of the story continues to live inside it every single day." Betty returned to room 114 in November, 2 weeks after the footage dropped, because the alternative was letting the hallway win. She rearranged the desks back into their circle. She picked up where the lesson had been interrupted. She did not discuss what had happened with her students directly, though several of them had seen the footage, and the quality of their silence on the first morning back told her everything she needed to know about what they understood and what they were carrying on her behalf. She taught. She graded journals. She brewed her second coffee at 9:15. She did all of it while Simone Garrett, in an office across the city, built a federal case document by document, deposition by deposition, with the methodical patience of someone who understood that justice in a courtroom was not a matter of moral clarity but of evidentiary architecture. You did not win by being right, you won by making it impossible for the other side to claim they were. The litigation lasted 7 months. There were motions and countermotions, delays and continuances, the procedural machinery of federal civil proceedings grinding forward at its own indifferent pace. The government's legal team was experienced and well-resourced and pursued every available avenue to limit discovery, narrow the scope of admissible evidence, and characterize the operation at Westbrook Academy as a good-faith effort that had encountered unforeseen complications. They used the word procedural, the way a magician uses a handkerchief, to draw attention toward the gesture and away from what was actually happening. Simone let them. And then she put the documents in front of the court. The internal communications were entered into evidence on a Wednesday in late spring. Simone presented them without dramatics, she read them aloud in the same measured, precise voice she used for everything, the voice that had learned over 15 years that the most devastating thing you can do with a damning document is simply allow it to be heard clearly. The analyst's report, dated 3 days before the operation. The biometric discrepancy, flagged in explicit language. The recommendation for secondary verification before any enforcement action. And then the email, the 3 words that sat above everything else in the record like a sentence that had been waiting to be read aloud in a federal courtroom since the moment it was written. Let's move. The government's counsel objected to the characterization of the email as evidence of deliberate disregard. Simone did not argue the characterization. She simply asked the court to note the date of the email, the date of the analyst's report, and the date of the operation, and allow the sequence to speak. The sequence spoke. Betty testified on Thursday. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything that mattered, thoroughly, quietly, without performance. Simone had walked her through the process in detail, the questions she would be asked by their side, the questions she would be asked by the government's attorneys, the moments when she should answer briefly and the moments when she should take her time. Betty had listened to all of it and then said, calmly, that she understood the strategy but that when she was in that chair she intended to tell the truth in her own words and trust that her own words were sufficient. Simone had looked at her for a moment and then said, yes. They are. She testified for 4 hours. She began with the ordinary, the journals, the morning, the second coffee, the particular quality of the October light coming through the windows of room 114 before everything changed. She described hearing the boots in the hallway. She described stepping out of her classroom and understanding before she had conscious language for what she was seeing. She described the agent's positioning, the way one had shifted to close the angle of the corridor, the feeling of geometry being used as a tool against her in a space where she had always felt, until that moment, entirely safe. And then the government's attorney asked her to describe W.H.